will now share with us.
Well, good morning. I don't have a sermon for you. I have a testimony, and it's a testimony that Carol and I kind of share. Some of it's going to be from my eyes, flavored by my eyes, but it's a testimony that we've talked over and we experienced together. And I want to share it with you because sometimes it shows you things about yourself to see them in other people. My mother, Dorothy Burdick, lives in the greater Sacramento area and turned 93 on April the 25th, 2023. That's this year. It's the first time she's ever been 93, you know. She's not been in the best of health. So Carol and I decided to travel west and be there for her birthday. My father died on Thanksgiving 2019, and Mom has missed him immensely. But recently she has turned to actually openly pining for Dad and to be with him. Our sisters reported that Mom would stay in bed all day, not go to meals. She lives in an assisted care facility. She would not go to meals and sometimes not get dressed and lay around hoping, literally hoping to die. She would say that. I know that you here that I know, and those probably that are zoomed in, you probably can understand a little bit about where I am. When this gets onto YouTube, there's no telling who's going to see it or where they are or how they're going to react or feel. And so I want to ask their indulgence, and yours, but their indulgence into understanding the spirit that I use to offer this testimony. We made the journey and it was somewhat difficult. My mobility was a problem. Gas was expensive, but traffic and weather were fantastic. We never got a drop of liquid on our windshield, so to speak. But a total of 4,500 miles is a total of 4,500 miles. It was a trip. While we drove with our trailer, Catherine, our daughter from Missouri, flew out there and met us, and for the purpose that she would see her grandmother again. And she's an adult. She knows the gravity of this visit. Honestly, part of my pleasure, though, in visiting Sacramento is to visit the congregation that I still call the Arcade Congregation. Its official name now is the Sacramento Congregation, but when I grew up there, the original Sacramento Congregation was then called 24th and K, and the Arcade Congregation was the Arcade Mission, and then the Arcade Branch. I grew up knowing both congregations very, very well. There was a very true love between the two congregations, and we often met in each other's facilities. So I was at home in the Arcade Congregation, as well as I was at 24th and K. Both congregations were business partners in a venture at the California State Fair, and it was called the Idola Restaurant. And both worked to put out meals at the fair. It was one of the few places at the fair where you could actually sit with a ceramic plate and real utensils and have a meal, basically home cooked, but not home cooked. And people just loved it. And a lot of money was made in that Idola restaurant. And the two congregations split it and used it to grow their facilities. And so the entire arcade congregation facility came from that Idola restaurant. And it went from a room not much bigger than the area where the techs sit and a restroom, and then a couple of other rooms to make a classroom area, and then a couple other rooms to make a larger education wing, and then a multi-purpose facility, much bigger than our community room, but like our community room, was a nice kitchen, and then after that, they built a chapel that's bigger than this chapel, and all with funds derived from the joint venture. Meanwhile, 24th and K also added things and improved things. And to see both of these congregations work together so hard and develop their facilities, I didn't know anything but that was the way to do things. As part of my ministry, I was involved in the priesthood teams of both congregations and was a counselor to several pastors in both congregations for years. These two congregations formed me, very literally. And with 24th and K closed now, the arcade congregation is essentially all that remains representative of my path, of my journey, of who I am and how I got to be here. Now you can feel that part of the sentimental draw of the arcade congregation, what it was for me. Very few of the current arcade congregation members remember my past years in Sacramento. A few of them do, and a few of them grew up with me, but most of them are new people and they don't know who this stranger is, basically. I moved away from there 30 years ago. 30 years changes a lot of demographics. But during my time there, I was ordained to 2 priesthood offices, and I actually served, as I said, for many, counselor for many of the pastors, I believe at least 5 pastors over the years. I served as a worship commissioner, as a youth assistant, an assistant with the youth ministries and similar positions. And much of who I am literally was developed there. When I go back there, it's always very emotional. And there were things that made this trip particularly so. The congregation is recently returning to function after closing for COVID. They are a younger demographic than ours and in a different state. So they had different rules that they had to abide by. They're also in a different mission center than ours, so they had different rules for that. But we met with them and they're back in their building meeting, and we enjoyed many things about the service that day. For a start, it was very warm and caring. Everybody greeted us and learned our names. And if they had time, they learned a little bit about where we're from and where I was originally from. And sometimes some of them knew some of my family that remain out there. Everyone entering was part of the family. There's an old song, and we tried singing it here a couple of times, and people didn't particularly care for it, but it had the line that you're part of the family. And, you know, when you, at this meeting, when you walked in, you were part of the family. The meeting was very informal and warm. And the theme that day was trust in God. But because of who they are, I'll share more about that later, there was a heavy sense of music with the theme trust in God. And the worship for that day was a worship in ministry. I want to share a little about the pastors of the group. I'm very proud of both Kim Barney and Scott Lacey. You say, well, why are you proud of the pastors at Arcade? They are not any of my family. However, both are members of my church family and always will be. You see, when I was one of the youth ministers, they were youth. And I saw them as young teenagers, and I saw them interact with their peers and with their congregations. And I'm very proud of both of them. They always will be part of my church family. When I was the assistant youth leader, I grew to know both of these kids at that time at like a youth camp or a weekend getaway that the youth would put on. Kim was Kim Baker then, and she was the daughter of Gary and Joyce Baker. And Gary and Joyce moved to the foothills around Placerville with their family when I was a young adult. In the Sacramento Valley area, the area that they moved into was often called the Gold Rush Country. It was the gold country or the gold rush country up in the hills. This is where John Sutter's people discovered gold and where all the miners came, and it's a very historic area, and it's pretty too. And that was where the gold rush was centered. Well, when Kim was young, I always recalled about her that she was usually a bit more reserved than her peers. I always felt that Kim I would describe her as being more mature than her peers. We'll get back to Kim in a minute. During that period when people moved to California in the gold country, I could say that this also matched my fascination with the history and the beauty of that area. And to Californians, that area is very much the way we Texans feel about the history of our Alamo. During the same general time, Gerald and Phyllis Lacey with Gary and Joyce Baker moved into that area, and Kim and, wait, hang on. Lost my place for a minute. Kim and Scott Lacey, who are the co-pastors of the congregation. Scott Lacey was a child of Gerald, Jerry, and Phyllis Lacey, and moved into that area. And the way I recalled Scott was that he was so musical. I don't want to risk guessing their actual ages, but I'm sure that they're middle-aged adults now. And I've been away 30 years. I guess those 30 years visited them, and they've been visited. But I'll bet that, and most of you have probably no idea who Kim Barney is. But I would bet several of you have heard of Scott Lacey over the years, either on Facebook or through church music circles. And he is an accomplished professional musician. I used to be part of the district. In those days, it was before we had districts, before we had mission centers. I used to be part of the district visiting ministry team and preached in congregations all over Northern California, including Placerville. When I would go there, where both of these youth attended, their primary musician was Scott Lacey, and he played for services since, he was their pianist since he was about 10 years old. He was very, very good. And several years ago, I was sitting in this sanctuary when then Pastor Marilyn Voorhees asked a newcomer if he would like to introduce himself. And as soon as he said his first sentence, I recognized Jerry Lacey, the voice, Jerry Lacey, who's Scott's father. And he was in San Antonio for some professional training. Of course, I spoke with him as soon as the service was over, and we renewed our acquaintance. The service that Sunday, this Sunday that we're speaking about, was handled by Kim and Scott. They were the presiders. And it was about as musical as you could imagine for not having a terribly large number of people there. There were about 20 people, and they apologized, saying that 2/3 of the congregation were at World Conference. Well, that means that there were expected to be, say, 60 people there. That's a pretty good sized congregation. But the love in the 24 who were there was deep. Part of the service was about the way that music, including hymns, might comfort us in times of trial. They asked the congregation to mention old favorites, and Carol suggested, how can I keep from singing? Well, we sing that here, and it's a good song. It's a really good song. And then after a few minutes and people talking about songs, I suggested Rain Down. I happen to like Rain Down, and it's a comforting song. And so after everybody that wanted to had shared a song, Scott suggested that we play and sing those two songs. I don't think he did it because it was Carol and I. I think he liked the two songs that were suggested, and it was really simply moving that that the congregation sang those songs that to us are songs of comfort. And I'm sure that most of the time that I heard and felt that singing, I was thinking of my mom and why we were there in California. After we had sung, Kim shared experiences when her love of music, she's not musical herself, but her love of music helped her draw closer to family during crises, and sometimes even just in normal times. Scott offered a testimony about his health. And if you followed Scott, he's had several serious health challenges, and he's had several brain operations. He doesn't hide it or any, I mean, this is stuff that he talks about in public. And Scott was challenged because he was in a crisis. He was at a point of decision making, and the week after the service, he was going to have to make some medical decisions. When he spoke about that, he asked for a congregation involvement in a prayer for his health and for wisdom in his decision making. Kim offered the prayer, but before she did, she called several of the congregation to specifically come forward and create a ring of people touching Scott and making a ring and touching Scott, not in the way that we do in administration, but in the way that we would create a circle, a ring of concern around Scott from shoulder to shoulder. When she asked me to join, I nearly cried because this was a love that has crossed many years of being away and brought a sudden together now into a wholesome, healing community. I don't know how many times I will ever be able to worship with those loved ones again in the future. But I can tell you that I can treasure that day, that service, that worship, and that ministry where they ministered to me and where we ministered to them. I'll have that as long as I can remember. I do know that anytime I'm able to create community the way they did, either with you here or others in other locations, that day's healing community goes with me and sustains and pours out into that being together with you or with others. That day, that service was about trust in God, and there was a sense of healing. Scott received a wonderful ministry regarding his health. I don't know what the outcome was, but he felt confident to make that decision that he was going to have to make. I know that he made that decision with the love of all the people in that meeting, including those who ringed him. I know that he had them with him when he had to make that decision. We also received a healing spirit ourselves. When we journeyed to California, we sometimes wondered if Mom would make it to her birthday. Well, she did. And while she was failing before we arrived and reverted even the day we left, during the visit, she was pretty with it. She knew who was there. She was enjoying it. She was energized for that short time. And it was a nice birthday. It'll be her nicest 93rd birthday, I know that. And it was as nice as it could have been hoped for. Healing, it has many forms. The day we left, our sister called and said that Mom was back to her habits of before we arrived, and she was staying in bed, missing meals, and not caring about life again. And we may never see her again, but she was able to enjoy family for that time. And when she was giving up, she was with her family. Healing, it has many forms. So my testimony, I would invite you to come to know Christ. Let the Christ in you be the presence of Christ to those around you, and view the presence of Christ inside those around you.